Good evening, everybody, again. My name is Alan Friedman, Vice President of the Australian Jewish Association, and also visible to you are David Adler, President of the AJA, and Ted Lapkin, our Executive Director. So good evening to you as well. And as well to our special guest for tonight, Andrew Tucker, who we will introduce in a moment. Ted and I will be speaking with Andrew for about 30 minutes, after which we will open up the discussion with a live Q&A session from the audience. And we're going to make a point of doing this promptly at 8:30 p.m. So if you have a question in mind for Andrew, can I suggest that you have it ready by that time, as we often get a flurry of people with questions in the last 10 minutes, and unfortunately we can't then take them all. And on that point, I'll just mention again that in the past, I have asked people to click on the reactions icon to register their interest, but that's actually not the right way to go about it. That's not the same as electronically raising a hand. So the best way to do this is to click on the participants icon, which you'll see at the bottom of your screen, and then click on the raise hand icon along the bottom. And if you don't see this, then it's because you've somehow turned off this function. So clicking on the green tick will also catch our attention. And as usual, the chat function is available for general comments, so feel free to send messages to the audience during the discussion. And I'll just remind everybody again that you've all been muted to prevent those annoying noises during the first part of the session, but we will allow you to unmute yourself for question time. Now, Andrew Tucker is an Australian-born lawyer who has practiced for almost 20 years as an attorney in the field of international law. Now based in the Netherlands, he leads the Hague Centre for International Law and Public Policy in the Middle East. And that's a think tank contributing to the development of freedom and justice in the Middle East based on the rule of law. Andrew is also working as legal counsel to the European Coalition for Israel. That's a Brussels-based organisation that focuses on education, advocacy and prayer, where he is part of a team advocating the position and interests of the State of Israel under international law within the European Union and the United Nations. From 2004 to 2018, Andrew served as Executive Director of Christians for Israel International, and now serves as their international advisor. He is the author of an excellent book on the subject we're going to talk about tonight, and it's called Israel on Trial. Andrew, welcome to the AJA. It's great to have you join us again.
Thank you very much, Alan.
Andrew, just to get us started, could you give us a brief rundown of how, when and where Lawfare started?
Okay, thanks, Alan. First of all, just a quick clarification. The organisation I'm working with, we've set up recently, has a slightly different title. It's called the Hague Initiative for International Cooperation, thinc with a C. I'll put the web address on the in the chat for you.
Good.
And technically, I'm no longer legal counsel for the European Coalition for Israel. So
okay, apologies.
I'm not representing them today, although I'm in close cooperation with them in different ways. So Lawfare is really the use of law and legal systems to advance political or military objectives. And it's been a phenomenon we've seen in many different contexts over the decades, and certainly over the last 100 years. International law, by definition, is very political by nature and very susceptible for being used to serve political purposes. And that's no surprise to anybody. And it occurs, across the board. Obviously, the UN and all the international institutions are fora and mechanisms for states to advance their own interests. But in the case of Israel, it's been particularly a problem since, I would say, ever since the creation of the State of Israel, and probably even earlier. But most importantly, since the 1970s, I think we saw, in my perspective, after the Yom Kippur War, which was the last war that was waged by Israel's neighbors to annihilate it. And there's no doubt all the wars that have been waged against Israel since May 1948 have been waged in order to destroy the Jewish state of Israel. And the Yom Kippur War of October 1973 was the last attempt of the Arab nations, or a coalition of Arab nations, to destroy Israel. And Israel survived, as many of you will know much better than I do, survived that war, but not in a resounding way as it won the Six-Day War in 1967. I think it was a great shock to Israel. And the result of that war was the Arab oil boycott and a launch of a raft of Palestinian-led terrorism throughout the world. And I think one aspect of all of this is that Israel's enemies then started to realize that they're not going to destroy Israel militarily. The way to do it is to use the international institutions to delegitimize Israel, to impose restrictions on it, to create a Palestinian state within Israel, and to impose a whole range of other measures which are going to limit Israel's freedom and its capacity to defend itself. And that's where I think we saw particularly the use of the UN as a forum to achieve those goals.
Ted.
Yeah, thank you. As of this moment, we await a decision by the International Criminal Court in The Hague as to whether it will allow a case to proceed against Israel for supposed violations of international law.
I'm not leaving you. I'm just
Is it something I said? So we're awaiting this ICC, this International Criminal Court case, the decision as to whether to proceed. The ICC, as is known by its initials, is a UN-sponsored institution established by the UN-sponsored Rome Statute, which brings to mind that famous Star Wars quote in which Obi-Wan Kenobi warns Skywalker that you'll never find a more wretched hive of scum and villainy than the Mos Eisley spaceport. But I guess Obi-Wan Kenobi never visited the UN in New York or the Human Rights Council in Geneva. But on a more serious note, in my view, this potential ICC action constitutes by far the most serious lawfare threat against Israel today. So given what you said before, that international law in particular lends itself to political bastardry, for want of a better term, what can you tell us about the political backstory behind this presumptive UCC prosecution? Beyond all the pseudo-legal fluff being bandied about, what's the down, dark, and dirty real reason why this case is being pushed by the ICC prosecutor? You live in The Hague. It's a very small town. So what is the cocktail circuit goss about this case?
Okay, well, perhaps just a little bit of background to start with. The International Criminal Court was set up in 2000, 2002. It's not technically a UN body. It's a separate institution. It's not run by the UN. It's not officially connected with the UN. So it's not part of the UN system as such. And I mean, I perhaps have a slightly less cynical view of the UN. I think the UN is, has potentially a lot of good things about it. It's unfortunately, like many institutions, it's got weaknesses and it is susceptible to misuse. But as such, I think there are many within the UN system who would like to see a more positive attitude towards Israel. So I wouldn't write off the UN at this point. As far as the ICC is concerned, it's set up under the Rome Statute. It's Israel and the United States have never signed up to the Rome Treaty. They've never signed it. They've never ratified it. And Israel did that, was very involved in all the negotiations leading up to the creation of the ICC, was very supportive of the ICC, but at the end of the day realized that it was highly susceptible to being hijacked for political purposes and pulled out. And I think what we're witnessing today is exactly what they feared would happen, namely that the ICC would be used to attack Israel's settlement policies, its presence in Judea and Samaria and Jerusalem. And the ICC is basically run by the state parties. And as you know, the United States is also not a state party to the ICC. The process started when, and this is the link with the UN, I think, when the UN in 2012 granted Palestine, as it's become known, non-member UN status in, I think it was 29th of November 2012. And Palestine has used that status to accede to a whole raft of international treaties, including the Rome Treaty setting up the ICC. So they're claiming they are an ICC state party, and they've used that to bring complaints, bring charges effectively against Israel in two areas. One is the Gaza conflicts. So they're saying everything that Israel's done since 2014 on the Gaza border is subject to ICC jurisdiction. And the second and the most concerning one is in relation to Israel's settlement or so-called settlement policies. Again, from 2014 onwards, they say are subject to ICC jurisdiction. And the court now is faced with having to make a decision. Is Palestine a state party to the ICC? And does that give the court the jurisdiction to investigate and potentially prosecute alleged crimes committed by Israeli leaders on so-called Palestinian territory? That's the issue that the court's deciding. It's a pre-trial chamber of the court that's been asked to make that decision.
But isn't there an element of blatant political subtext in that by many the ICC has been seen to be something of a failure in terms of the number of successful prosecutions, and therefore they think this might be an easy self-justifying win?
Look, there's no doubt, and the ICC's not been a success, and it's under an awful lot of pressure and scrutiny at the moment on all sides. As you say, I think in its history of almost 20 years, I think it's had 4 major convictions. It's cost billions and billions of dollars to run it, and people are not satisfied at all. And you're right. I mean, I think this is seen as being a potentially
low-hanging fruit.
Yeah, but on the other hand, the prosecutor has to deal in a way with these kinds of cases that are brought before her. She carried out what's called an initial examination, and she's come to the view that she thinks there are potential war crimes committed by Israeli leaders, and there's an enormous amount of pressure on her, certainly from the Arab world and those supporting the Palestinian cause, to go ahead with this. But she could equally quite easily have said that this is basically a political case and there is no basic case against Israelis. I think quite rightly she's, passed the ball, as it were, kicked the ball over to the court itself to decide whether or not it has jurisdiction. She knows this is a politically hot potato, a nightmare really, and she'd rather not make that decision and wants the court to make the decision.
So you mentioned 2 possible kind of axes of advance for the court. One would be traditional Hague Convention war crimes in terms of the 2014 war and, the issues of distinction, all the stuff that's in the Geneva Conventions and the Hague Conventions. And the other one would be the settlements, the illegality purportedly of Jewish communities in Judea and Samaria. Can you talk a little bit about those two alternatives?
Right.
Or maybe they'll proceed with both. Who knows?
Yeah. Look, it's all about war crimes, and what's known as international humanitarian law. So it's the law of warfare. And in relation to Gaza, the perception is that even though Gaza is not a state, Gaza is not a separate political entity, there is an international conflict. And the view is that Israel's conflict with Hamas in Gaza is an international conflict that's subject to the ICC jurisdiction. And then the whole question is whether or not Israel has used excessive force in relation to that those conflicts. Now, there's been an awful lot of political hype around Israel's use of force in relation to the Gaza Strip, and the ICC is. The biggest problem with the ICC is its one-sided source of information. It's only getting information from the Palestinian side. This is the predicament that Israel is faced because it's not a member of the ICC. It doesn't want to be part of this circus, what it considers to be a circus. So it's not providing information, although it does behind the scenes. So that's one set of circumstances. The other is the settlement policies. Now, the argument about settlements is that these are occupied territories and you cannot transfer or deport your population into occupied territories. It's the Fourth Geneva Convention, and those provisions have been taken up in the Rome Statute. So, unfortunately, there is a kind of universal consensus that these are occupied territories. I think it's very difficult to, in fact, it's almost impossible now to argue they're not occupied territories in the international law sense. So it comes down to the question of whether or not there's been, Israeli settlement policies are effectively a way of moving Israelis into these territories. And this deeply embedded sense that these territories do not belong to Israel. This is the core of the whole thing.
And that brings me to another issue, and that, this is the centenary of the San Remo Treaty, and the San Remo Treaty basically was, part of the victorious Allies divvying up the carcass of the Ottoman Empire after World War I. And the terms of the San Remo Treaty, Article 4 explicitly talks about the establishment of a Jewish home for the benefit of the Jewish people. And then Article 5 talks about the fact that the territory should be indivisible. And of course, the Brits completely ignored that in 1920 when they hived off Transjordan and gave it to King Abdullah, the Hashemites. So when you have to weigh San Remo on the one hand and the Fourth Geneva Convention that you were talking about before, how does that work out? What's the balance?
Right. So just so people are sort of all on one page, San Remo was a decision of the Allied powers in April 1920 to create the mandates for Mesopotamia, Syria and Lebanon and Palestine. And that led to the creation of mandates. And the mandate for Palestine, 1922, is an international treaty. You're absolutely right. Treaty signed by all 51 League of Nations states. So it's a binding treaty under international law, which technically speaking is still binding on all those states and was specifically and explicitly preserved under Article 80 of the UN Charter. So when the League of Nations came to an end at the end of the Second World War and was basically replaced by the UN, Article 80 of the UN Charter said all pre-existing rights of peoples should be and are, still applicable and need to be respected. And that was clearly intended to deal with the specific situation of Palestine and the rights of the Jewish people to the homeland of the Jewish people in Palestine under the mandate. So I think it's quite right to say that those treaty obligations remain applicable. Therefore, on the basis of those treaty and the mandate for Palestine, when the state of Israel was created in May 1948, it assumed and took on the borders and the territory of the mandate, which by that point had been divided. East of the Jordan River became Transjordan, which has become the state of Jordan. Now, there's a lot of controversy about whether that was legal or not. That happened under Churchill. But certainly everything west of the Jordan River was intended for the Jewish homeland. And there's a strong legal line of argument that on the 14th of May, 1948, automatically the territorial boundaries of the mandate, everything west of the Jordan River, became the territory of the state of Israel. Now, what happens, and I think, unfortunately, this is where it gets difficult because nobody really talked about it at the time. There was not a lot of discussion simply because Israel was surviving and Jordan occupied half of Jerusalem and all of what became known as the West Bank, which was clearly illegal because it resulted from an illegal act of force by Jordan and its allies. It was an illegal occupation and an illegal annexation or purported annexation by Jordan. And then Israel freed those territories in June 1967. And that would be the moment in time at which Israel could and perhaps should have said, these territories belong to us. They belong to us because of this principle of uti possidetis juris. It's the one I just explained to you, that the borders of the mandate became the borders of the state of Israel. But Israel didn't. It applied sovereignty to Jerusalem, but not to the rest of Judea and Samaria. And this is where I think the confusion has come in. Because Israel itself, for various reasons, and you see it in Israel today, there are some who support sovereignty, but there are many who don't. They would rather see a Palestinian state in Judea and Samaria than they would see Israel claiming sovereignty. So I think that internal division has led Israel to, I think,
be a little schizoid about the future.
Yeah.
Just going back for a moment to the ICC, we've now, we would say that Israel has served as a so-called canary in the coal mine for the democratic world on a variety of issues, from terrorism and to other threats. Iraqi nuclear proliferation, for example, the Israelis were condemned for destroying the Iraq reactor, and then 10 years later, in 1991, everybody was wiping their brow during the first Gulf War and saying, thank God the Israelis did it. So my question is, if the ICC prosecution of Israel proceeds, are we right to fear that this precedent at some future point might be turned against Australian diggers?
No, I'm not sure that that's necessarily the case. I mean, there is this move, tendency within the ICC to want to now prosecute, especially the US and UK forces, for their roles in respectively Afghanistan and Iraq.
We've had troops in both theaters.
Yes, so I think that there is a risk there for Australia, but I don't think that flows from this Palestine case.
Okay.
Can I just jump in for a quick moment, Ted, please? Sure. Andrew, the way you're speaking, it almost sounds as if our side has lost the battle in terms of legitimacy in the land or the area. When you say that most of the world would recognise Israel as occupying Palestinian land, that says to me that we've actually been defeated in terms of getting the truth out there. What do you say to that?
Thank you for the question, Alan. It's a very good one. I mean, I think we are playing catch up. It would be better if we had been doing all of this 50 years ago rather than now. A lot of water has passed under the bridge since 1967, which we're trying now to overcome. So yes, in a way, I think we are fighting an uphill battle. I don't think we've lost it. But I'll give you an example. The Partition Plan of November 1947. So this is 6 months prior to the creation of the State of Israel. The UN General Assembly adopted a resolution proposing creation of Arab and Jewish states in the western half of Palestine, with Jerusalem as an international city. Now, that was a UN resolution which, first of all, UN General Assembly resolutions have no binding effect whatsoever. They are political statements, not legal, not laws. And secondly, the resolution, even though the resolution was adopted, the plan was never accepted or let alone implemented. So the Partition Plan has no status whatsoever under international law. Nevertheless, it is consistently referred to as being somehow effective, perhaps even has been the source of Israel's legitimacy, partly because it's referred to in the Israeli Declaration of Independence. But I think, you know, we have to keep explaining this, which are really elementary things, namely that General Assembly resolutions have no binding force. But we have to keep explaining it. Why? Because the idea has developed that the UN General Assembly somehow has a say in all of this. So we're fighting against a general perception, which I think has developed, and it's not only in relation to Palestine, but it's a general perception that the UN somehow has a right to make decisions in these areas. It's a kind of a public affairs campaign, not so much a legal one, although it's happening within the legal institutions. But we have to explain to people that Israel is a sovereign state. It was created and birthed out of the mandate for Palestine, not out of the UN General Assembly. And it has a right to exist, and it has a right to secure borders just as any other state does. But it would be helpful if Israel itself was clearer in explaining to the world that it has sovereign rights in relation to East Jerusalem and the whole of Judea and Samaria. At least it has the claim. And I think part of the difficulty, I'm not putting the blame on Israel, but I'm saying part of the difficulty is that I think over the 50 years, for various reasons, you know, Israel has entered into the Oslo Accords, which are extremely complex and confusing documents in many ways. And the perception has been that Israel is not claiming sovereignty over these territories, but is somehow sovereignty is up for grabs, and it's whoever has the strongest voice. And unfortunately, the Palestinians have a very strong political voice. So we're playing catch up, I think. We have very good arguments, and the war has not been lost, but we're fighting an uphill battle.
Okay. Right, we're going to open up the discussion to the audience. So we've got a question from Hugh, so I'll call on Hugh in a moment. But now's the time to start preparing questions, folks. If you've got a question for Andrew, just electronically raise your hand, go to the participants icon and click raise hand, and that way we'll make sure we get through everybody. Hugh, if you would please unmute yourself and then ask your question.
Andrew, to what extent has international policy, i.e., to give you an example, the EU policy that there has to be a Palestinian state, to what extent has policy been confused with international law? I was just wondering if you could explain the difference between policy and law, and actually UN Security Council Resolution 2334 possibly could be in that category as well.
Thank you, Hugh. That's a very good question. I think the answer is that the two things have been totally confused. So, and 2334, I think, is a good example, which is a UN Security Council resolution. And as we know, Security Council resolutions are very politically led solutions. The problem is, I think, twofold. One is that international lawyers have tended to become very politically focused. So you have, I think, many international lawyers who, because they want to see a Palestinian state being created, are tending to interpret international law in order to achieve that objective. And I think the example of using the Fourth Geneva Convention, for example, and completely ignoring San Remo and the mandate is a good example. And they're relying on this whole idea of Palestinian right to self-determination, which was something that has developed as a legal doctrine since the Second World War. So they're applying it retrospectively, and they're basically saying the Palestinians were there first. They have a right to self-determination within Western Palestine. So retrospectively, they are saying San Remo and the mandate were somehow illegitimate because they were overriding the rights of the Palestinians. And I think that is a rewriting of history and a rewriting of international law, because the Palestine Mandate was part of a broader political solution in which the Arab Palestinians obtained their right to self-determination in the form of the state of Jordan. The state of Jordan was, Transjordan and then later Jordan, was created for the very reason of giving the Arab Palestinians autonomy. But that has been completely ignored by those now who would like to see a policy outcome, and that is the creation of a state of Palestine. So I think the answer to your question, Hugh, is that law and policy are being completely confused, not only by the politicians, but also by the legal fraternity itself. If that makes any sense.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. Reuven, your turn. Please unmute yourself and ask your question. Reuven? Where's Reuven? No?
Okay.
Oh, there you
Hello.
go.
Can you hear me?
Yep, go ahead.
All right. Andrew, thank you for your presentation tonight. And before I even ask the question, if I just clarify, the objective of law, the whole purpose of law, is to prevent anarchy. The objective is to have peace and harmony. Then it begs the question: what is the law? What's the reference for law? We know we have statute law, we have common law, etc. But what are the sources of law? Now, we say that from the Jewish perspective, we say that law, how international law as well as just Jewish law, is based on the Torah. You've heard, what the Torah. We remember the Torah, right? Okay. Now, the opening words of the Torah, God created the heavens and the earth, the heavens and the earth, and etc. But it begs a question, and one of our famous commentators raises the question: the Torah isn't written in chronological order, so why is it necessary to just begin it with these words? And he responds: is that should the nations of the world come along and accuse Israelites of having stolen the land from the Canaanites, say, well, look, God created the world. He allowed the Canaanites to have temporary access to the thing. He promised it to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, their descendants. He took it away from them and gave it to the Israelites. That's our justification and our claim to the land. Now, as far as international law goes, common international law from today, so the Balfour Declaration allowed biblical borders. There was a question. Okay, the biblical borders. And
Reuven, you're going to have to ask your question, mate.
The question, okay, the question now is that the whole purpose, Jordan was created. The word Palestinian referred to Jews during the Mandate period. Then you become Jordanians, and now you have this group that's coming in, and their whole motive is not to create a Palestinian state within certainly. They want the whole lot from the river to the sea. They're not hiding it. So why should there be any argument, any question about it? I mean,
okay, I think it was a speech.
Yeah, I think
it's a statement.
Is it a question?
Well,
why should it be a question? I mean, even, you know.
that's the big question that we're all trying to answer. Thank you, Reuven. But I think we know where you're coming from. Jeff.
Well, if I could just make one comment there, Alan. I mean, I think it's a very good point. You know, at one level, at a deeper level, in a way, I think we're seeing a clash of paradigms, a clash of worldviews, and part of that clash, I think, is, you know, the modern worldview, which has developed, I think, primarily since the Second World War, is that, you know, it's all about human rights. It's about rights of individuals. And what I find is often, you know, when I have this conversation or discussion with modern international lawyers, they're not terribly interested in San Remo or the Mandate because it's kind of like prehistory to them. It's it's a post-World War I world order where the colonialist powers seem to have power and influence. They're more interested now in individual human rights, which unfortunately I think leads them to ignore what San Remo and the Mandate accepted, and I think quite rightly, and that is the pre-existing, the natural indigenous rights of the Jewish people in this part of the world. You know, they belong in Judea and Palestine. The whole nation of Israel, the Jewish people, was born in Judea and Samaria. There's no nation of people in the world that has a more natural connection with this land than the Jewish people with Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria. But that narrative is so unknown, is so unfamiliar to most modern international lawyers, and unfortunately many of them are Jewish, prominent Jewish international lawyers who don't want to see that anymore. They would rather see the fulfillment of what is, you know, and I think there is a problem with the position of the non-Jews in the land. You know, this issue has to be resolved somehow. And we could go back to the Torah and also talk about the need for the Jewish people to look after and respect the foreigners in the land. But those foreigners have to accept that it's the Jewish people that have sovereignty in the land. It works both ways.
Yes, absolutely. Jeff, please unmute yourself and ask your question, and then we'll go to Leon. And just a reminder to everybody, please keep the questions brief so that we can fit you all in. Jeff?
I made it. Hooray, hooray, I made it. There's much hoo-ha about international law, international humanitarian law, Geneva Conventions and binding and non-binding treaties. Who on earth enforces international law if there is no army? Because United Nations is a farce. It doesn't do anything. It just talks.
Hmm.
That's
Yes,
the question.
Jeff,
Who enforces international law? How can it be enforced? The whole thing is a
Good
farce.
question. Some people say that there's no such thing as international law. Indeed, for that very reason, there is no legislature, there is no judiciary, and there is no executive. The three things that you need in a national legal system to make it effective and to balance powers, you do not have in the international legal system. So you're quite right. At the end of the day, it becomes politics, and it becomes whoever has the majority voice within the system. So probably you could say the only entity which potentially has a role and a right to enforce it is the Security Council, which has a power under the UN Charter in certain circumstances, Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, to take legally binding action. It's never done so in relation to the Israel-Palestine case, but it did, for example, in relation to Iraq. So in that sense, I would say the Security Council, at the end of the day, is the only body that can really enforce international law.
Okay. Leon, please unmute yourself, and then we'll go to Barry.
Good evening, Andrew. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can, Barry.
Sorry, I don't have a camera. You can't see me. I can see you. Andrew,
Okay.
with reference to all those international lawyers who have, quote unquote, forgotten about or who disregard San Remo and the Mandate for Palestine, have you ever asked any of them why it is that they're so zealous in promoting the cause of a recently fabricated collective entity who've called themselves Palestinians, and yet totally ignore the natural rights of an ancient, cohesive nation, cohesive ethnically and geographically, namely the Kurds? And why is it that they don't have any quarrel with a foreign Jordanian dynasty who was dragged up from the Hijaz, Saudi Arabia today, dragged up and was given control of the territory east of the Jordan? How much hypocrisy is there in the international lawyers community?
Thank you, Barry. Yeah, look, tough question. Look, I'm not quite sure what drives all of this. I mean, I'm guessing probably as much as you are in a sense. There is somehow a deep sense that the Jewish people and the state of Israel should subject themselves to modern perceptions of international law more than anybody else. I don't know, some kind of sense that more than anybody else, the Jewish people are responsible for complying with modern notions of international law, perhaps because it's kind of like an inverted guilt complex for what happened, you know, prior to the creation of the state of Israel. But all I can say is that, you know, that they all jump on the case of Israel, and they do not. You're quite right. They're not jumping in to fight for the Kurdish people. They're not standing up against the Hashemite, you know, domination of Jordan. I don't know what to answer, except that I think it's partly driven by a feeling that the Jewish people are more responsible and should be held more accountable than anybody else. And I think it's got to do with an innate sense that the Jewish people and the Jewish nation is unique and underlies really all notions of international law that we do have, but they just don't want to recognize it. So we're playing psychology here a little bit. There is no rational answer for this, not the slightest rational answer at all. And this makes the conversation so difficult. It really does.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Barry, and then we've got Dennis, Keel, Moish, and Alex. So Barry, please unmute yourself.
Hi, Andrew. Barry Rogers here. You talked about the Palestinians having a very strong voice. To what extent has that been undermined and weakened by Trump's deal with UAE and other moves to get other Arab states holding out the olive branch to Israel?
Okay, so the question is about this latest development with the agreement to normalize relations between Israel and the UAE. I think, to my mind, this is a really important development. I think it's a paradigm change, respecting this new, which has been going on for a number of years, but the relations that Israel has, particularly with the Sunni states in the region. I think one of the things it's doing is it is showing up the hypocrisy of the Palestinian position. I think it's showing up that the Palestinians cannot just simply demand anymore everything that they want. There is a price that they will have to pay as well. I don't know quite where it leaves the Trump peace plan, to be honest. Because now that's all being put to one side. And in a way, I think it's showing up that the Trump peace plan, and I understand, within the White House itself, there are now divisions. I think Trump is pulling away from his own peace plan, to be honest, whereas I think Kushner would like to push on with it and see the creation of the Palestinian state, which the plan, I think, intends to achieve. So, but it is showing up the reality of the leadership of the Palestinian Authority, its rejectionist stance, which is being rejected by most of the Arab world now.
Yes. Dennis, can you unmute yourself, please, and ask your question?
There we go. You indicated that in 1948, Israel had the opportunity to declare its sovereignty over the entirety of the west of the area west of the Jordan. I suppose that another opportunity would have occurred in 1967 after the war, when they could have again taken that opportunity to declare sovereignty over all the land that they had taken between the current border of Israel and the Jordan River. The Israelis did not do that. One of the reasons I assume that the Israelis did not do that is because they did not want to have a very large population of non-Israelis be absorbed into Israel, therefore creating a social problem, a demographic issue, and the potential at that time was that the people living in the West Bank and in Gaza had a higher birth rate, and that they might swamp the Jewish nature of the land of Israel. How do you therefore view the claims that the Palestinians now make, given that they have been given effectively that part of the West Bank which they currently occupy, yet they continue to demand more?
Thank you, Dennis. Yes, I think, just to be clear, I think in 1948, the assumption was, and I think quite rightly, that the State of Israel assumed the borders of the pre-existing mandate for Palestine. I don't think it needed, it talks in the Declaration of Independence about Eretz Israel, which implicitly is talking about all of the land of Israel. And quite rightly, it didn't refer to specific borders. I think perhaps confusingly, it referred back to the Partition Plan, which is created a sense that maybe Israel was relying on the Partition Plan, which it wasn't. But just to be clear, I don't think what Israel said at that point determined either way what its borders were. I think you're quite right. The point in 1967, at the end of the Six-Day War, when Israel had the opportunity to apply sovereignty over all of Judea and Samaria, the very reason they didn't was, I think, two reasons. One is, yes, they didn't want to take sovereignty over a hostile Palestinian people. And, you know, the debate was quite open at that point. The second thing is they didn't want to offend the international community. And the legal advice to the government at that time was the international world considers this to be occupied territory, therefore we should too. So it was left in limbo and in this very unclear situation where Israel said, we don't claim sovereignty, but we will negotiate for peace. And the Palestinians have rejected every offer at every moment in time since the very beginning, since 1920. There's never been one proposal they've accepted for anything less than the whole of Palestine. And I would fully agree that at the end of the day, the Palestinian objective, and it's written into the Palestinian Charter, which they have never changed, even though Arafat promised to do so in 1993, they've never changed their charter, which says the PLO's objective is to liberate all of Palestine, which is why Abbas walks away time and again from every offer. Unfortunately, in the meantime, and this was, I think, the disaster of under the Obama regime, is the international community have basically given them everything beyond the green line. So the Palestinians will never accept any compromise within the West Bank. They will never accept a compromise anyway, for the reason that I think their real objective is the whole of Palestine. But there will never be a peace agreement between Israel and the PLO in relation to the West Bank, because Israel will never give up Jerusalem and the PLO will never accept anything less than the whole thing. So the idea of a peace agreement, I think, is a complete illusion. And then the question is, well, what is going to break through all of this? And I think at the end of the day, it will only be Israel applying its sovereign claims to these territories.
Yeah, so it sounds like the Palestinians have played their hand very, very well.
They've played their hand extremely well. And they've, of course, had a lot of support in doing so. And I think the Western nations have played their hand very badly.
Yes.
Unfortunately, driven by European self-interest. You know, that's another story. But Europe basically in 1973, for its own self-interest, allowed all of this to happen. So Israel has had very few allies out there who've been willing to, you know, go against the consensus.
There have been some glorious moments. Senator Moynihan ripping up the Zionism equals racism resolution from the podium of the General Assembly. There have been a few bright sparks, just a few.
There have been. Yes.
Yes. Okay.
Can I?
No, hang on. Whoever's speaking, you need to put your hand up electronically. So we've got Keel, Moish and Alex to come. Keel, can you unmute yourself and ask your question, please?
Yeah, hello, Andrew. I was just wondering if there, lack of a better word, sort of prima facie gets established against Israel, what does that begin to look like for Israel then? Is it a list of officials that are put forward to appear? Is there some kind of warrant issued? Look, I dare say if the case does get up against them, there'd be some sort of implications for sort of those Israeli officials to be able to conduct their travel abroad, or just general, I guess generally. Thanks.
Thanks, Keel. I must say, I found it a little difficult to hear the first part of your question. I don't know, Alan, if you can summarise the question.
No, I had a bit of trouble. There was a bit of echo.
Yeah, he was asking about the practical ramifications if Israel is found guilty in the ICC in terms of Israeli military leaders traveling overseas, international arrest warrants, and the like.
Thank you. Yeah, good question, Keel. What happens? I mean, there's a long way to go still in all of this. If the court decides that it has jurisdiction, and that's the issue it's now deciding on, if it decides it does, then the prosecutor will proceed with an investigation. If she decides at the end of the investigation that war crimes have been committed, she can bring charges against specific individuals. Now, in order to carry out an investigation, she needs access to people and information. And this is where it's going to get very difficult, because she really cannot gain access to Palestine without Israel's consent, simply because it's very difficult to travel. That's the first point. If a case were brought, let's say a case were brought against Netanyahu or Benny Gantz for past or current settlement policies, then she will issue warrants, and then it will be very difficult for them to travel, because ICC member states will be bound to comply with the Rome Statute, which means they have to cooperate, they have to provide their resources and assistance. So they won't be able to travel to Europe. And we're going to see a diplomatic war going on, really, because the US has basically declared war on the ICC and said, if you, ICC, or if any other ICC member state starts attacking Israeli leaders, we will do the same thing. So we're going to have a very difficult situation, I think, on our hands.
Yeah, okay. Moish, your turn. Please unmute yourself.
I think it's fair to say that the Arab world and the Muslim world are still very, very religiously oriented and very, very rooted in their tradition. And then there's this concept of Muslim land, that it's all once Muslim land, it's always Muslim land. To what extent does that still play a role? And is Israel, from that perspective, all these white, blue-eyed European Jews who come here really don't belong here? We may acknowledge the Sephardi Jews, but certainly not the Europeans. And to what extent does that still play a role in this whole saga?
Thank you, Moshe. Good question. My own perception, I think you've seen this with the reactions to the latest deal with the UAE, is it's, the reaction of Turkey, particularly in Iran, and also the Palestinians. They say this is a betrayal of Islamic interests. Any normalization with Israel, and this is where it goes, goes beyond the rational, because the deal with the UAE has no negative impact on the Palestinians or the peace process. The very fact that a Sunni state is agreeing to treat Israel and therefore Jewish people as normal is a betrayal of Islamic interests. This is what they say. So I think it shows very clearly that it's certainly in a section or a part of the Arab world is driven absolutely by a particular approach to Islamic identity. And yes, they would be willing to accept the existence in the land of Jews who were there before 1920, but they don't accept that any Jew since 1920 has had the right to come into the land since that time. I mean, you read this in the Palestinian Charter itself. You can live there as a dhimmi, as a Jewish or Christian dhimmi in the land, but that's it. Jewish sovereignty is an anathema to that approach to Islamic identity.
Okay, we've got time for one more question because we have reached our time. Ruthie, you're the last one. Please unmute yourself and ask your question.
I want to add to the notion of a Palestinian state. I heard today Udi Ari, who is a very well-known and respected Arab issues analyst, and he said from all his dealings with the Arabs, and for many, many, many years, the Palestinians don't want really a state. Whatever I'm just adding to what you said and what many people say here. The problem is not just that they don't want a state. They don't want a state, and they eventually.
Okay.
Okay.
I think we might have to.
The bell has.
Ruthie.
Tolled.
Yeah, I think that was a comment rather than a question anyway.
Okay. On that note, David, would you like to just wrap up and tell people what's coming up and what they need to do?
Certainly. Well, firstly, I want to thank Andrew for a really fascinating discussion and the way that he dealt with a whole range of questions, obviously very knowledgeable. We are at time, so I'll be very brief and just run through a couple of things. Firstly, I'm going to show what we've got coming up next week. And thanks to Ted, we will be the first in Australia to be talking with a new member of the Knesset. And I want to draw to your attention, sometimes in parliaments around the world, a speech is made that has wide ramifications. And that occurred in Israel just a couple of days ago from the new MK, a religious woman who actually is in Benny Gantz's party called Telia Friedman. And you can see here the headline from the Jewish Telegraph Agency. This speech by Telia Friedman, a new Knesset member, has Israelis fired up about political moderation because she's taken to task those on both sides of Israeli politics who have caused a whole series of an election and even the possibility that we might be facing a fourth election in Israel. So we have her as the guest next week. Should be a fascinating insight into Israeli politics. And just finally, if you're not yet actively supporting AJA, here are 3 things that you should be doing. Like and follow the AJA Facebook page for the news and views. We're happy to put anyone here on the email list. If you're not yet on it, just send an email to the office@jewishassociation.org.au. And of course, we want to encourage membership and contributions to AJA as well. So that's it, Alan. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, David. Andrew, from me again, thank you so much for your time. I did mention your book. I actually have a copy which I've read. I don't have it with me because we've just moved home and it's in storage somewhere. But it's called Israel on Trial. Have a look at it, everybody. It's a fascinating book. It really tells you everything you need to know about this particular subject. So thank you, Andrew, again. And we've put your website up on the chat group, so people are welcome to have a look at that also. So on that note, we'll say good night to everybody and look forward to seeing you again next week for that very interesting topic. So thanks to Ted, thanks to David. Good evening to you all.